To look at all the ins and outs of this, I'm joined by University of Regina political science professor Jim Farney. Jim, what did you make of the federal government's meeting yesterday?
I watched parts of it. It wasn't Parliament, and they weren't meeting. They were meeting as a committee of the whole. So even though all the MPs could be there, they weren't operating under the normal rules. Some people did have trouble logging in, especially MPs from rural regions, and we need to pay attention to that. But it worked. And one thing that I noticed, I've never loved the heckling that you do in parliaments, and there wasn't any of it because there couldn't be. So, it worked okay, I would say.
Do you think that here in Saskatchewan, politicians should be doing the same?
I would say I do think so. I mean, there are some alternatives because our legislature is so small, right? So if you look at the national parliament, there's 300 odd MPs. The Brits have over 650. You use different rules in those circumstances. We've only got 61, and we only have a quorum rule of 15. And I find it really hard to believe that we couldn't make a video conference work with 15 or 20 MLAs to kind of provide some public accountability.
Do you see any potential problems if they aren't recalled?
Yeah, so I think there's two. There's an important administrative one. The spring session is when we do all the financial work of government. So we kind of had a budget announcement and then a revenue update, but we kind of didn't because it was right when the state of emergency was declared. And we've talked about that a fair bit, but it's also later on in the spring session when committees get to work looking through the estimates, which is the accounting of spending from the previous year. That work is really important, and there's no indication yet of how that's going to happen. It's also easy to forget that committees do lots of kind of detailed work on legislation and ministerial oversight. So it's not just the question period that stops or has stopped for us. It's all that kind of more detailed scrutiny that we usually don't pay a lot of attention to, but is fairly important.
Do you see any risks of them actually coming back? Like risks that could happen if they come back?
I mean, obviously there's the health risk, which I don't want to diminish. There is, I think, maybe the other risk, and I think this is also important, and it's really hard to judge. It is an election year, and I don't think that this would be a great time for politicians to get super partisan, right? I mean, this is a collective emergency. We need accountability and debate, but we also don't need people scoring cheap political points off of each other. I think coming back would require a lot of trust and a lot of maturity from both sides of the aisle to say, we realize we're in deeply unusual times, and we are going to do things like not heckle and maybe not go for that easy zinger that we otherwise would.
Jim, that leads me to my next question. We do have an election scheduled for October. We know the Premier was considering an early call before the pandemic. Do you think we could see an election before October or even in October?
I would be very surprised to see one before October. I think it's now pretty much impossible to imagine a justification for the Premier to go to the people and say we need to go earlier than October. I can't fathom that. In October, I think it becomes a pretty complex piece of administration of rolling something out that's safe. I think the campaign would look very different. But I think if it's at the if the infection rate is at the place that we're at now, and we get creative about allowing people to vote by mail, or last time Election Saskatchewan had some pilots where they were bringing the ballot box to people who couldn't get out of their homes. If we're flexible with that type of thing, I think we probably could run the vote in October.
Is there a benefit or a risk to the government going early if they decided to call an early election?
Again, I think there's a couple of things. One is that justifying to the people why you're going early. I think that's hard. I also think it might look like, we're all worried about the health effects of COVID-19, but the economic effects are even worse. And it could look like a government trying to ask for a 4-year mandate before we're really aware of how rough a time Saskatchewan's looking forward to because of the economic shock.
Jim, how do you think the Premier and the government have handled the pandemic?
I think in terms of the public health stuff, like it's been, to my mind, very solid. The communications have been solid. The policy, I'm not a public health person, but it all that stuff seems good. The part that I am worried about is actually exactly this question of the legislature sitting. I think there are ways for us to have a legislative session that don't pose a health risk. So far, we haven't had much debate. Really, the only thing the Premier said is that he and his office have been completely focused on managing COVID-19, and that's probably fair. I think the longer we get into the response, though, especially if it continues to be a fairly mild thing here in Saskatchewan, the harder it is to justify not having a discussion about reopening the legislative session. You know, if golf courses are open and the ledge isn't, we've got our priorities wrong. And so I think it is important that we get some clarity for the budgeting stuff. We know we're looking at a massive deficit. I get very uncomfortable when the government's spending over $4 billion by special warrant. And knowing that we're headed into an election at the start of what some analysts are calling a Great Depression without parliamentary debate, that just should not happen in our system of government.
And finally, I'm curious how you would say Ryan Miley and the opposition NDP have handled their side of things.
I think for them, it's in some ways a more delicate dance. I'm sure Miley desperately wants to put on, I mean, he has put on his scrubs, and that's good, but in a public way and make some political traction out of his healthcare expertise. That would be a bad thing. I mean, this is a moment where the health advice comes from the chief medical officer. So I think they've done okay to position themselves as an alternative. I think the question for both parties headed into the election is this is a dramatic shock to our political and economic system. And if their election platforms look more or less exactly like where they were standing the 1st of January, I would say that they would both have wasted this time. And that's especially true for the opposition, who's not trying to manage this massive whole of government response.
Thanks so much for your time, Jim.
Thanks for having me on, Sam.
Jim Farney is the department head and an associate professor in politics and international studies at the University of Regina.